Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I am the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And today we have a really nerdy, data-filled presentation for you. We are going to be focusing on our latest research at the Environmental Voter Project, and in particular, the number and demographic qualities of environment-first voters in 12 red states that we have studied. We've got a lot of great data for you here today, and we're really glad that you're joining us. I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. And let's go ahead and get started. So this is what the presentation is going to look like. I am going to start with only the briefest of overviews of our work at the Environmental Voter Project. This is not an introductory webinar to EVP's work, but we do know that some of you are joining us for the first time and you're curious about our work, and so we're going to give a very brief overview, but we'll also provide links in the notes to this recording on YouTube if you're interested in learning more about us. The core of this presentation is going to be what you see on number 2 there, and that is our voter file analysis of these environment-first voters in red states. We will then close with discussing ways that you can help us mobilize these voters across the 19 states that we work in. In short, what the Environmental Voter Project is we are a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on the 2 things that you see on this slide: identifying environmentalists who don't vote and turning them into consistent voters. That is it. That's what we do. We don't try to change people's minds. We don't try to get them to care more about climate change. We don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. All of those things that you're used to environmental nonprofits doing, we actually don't do those. Instead, we are laser focused on finding the people who are already with us. They already care deeply about climate change, clean air, clean water, environmental justice. They care about these things so much that it's their top priority, yet they're not voting. And that enables us to make a purely behavioral intervention, to find these people, not waste any time with issue education or persuasion or mind changing, and just do the behavior change stuff. That's what we focus on at the Environmental Voter Project. And the reason we focus on it is that there are literally millions, tens of millions of these already registered voters who list climate as their top priority, yet they're not casting ballots, even in the largest and most important of federal elections. This is an enormous opportunity for the climate and environmental movements. There is a lot of latent political power out there, not just in the red states that I'm going to talk to you about in a few minutes, but across the entire country. And we need to tap into this power because our greatest need right now is to get more politically powerful. The way that we do it, and again, forgive me for doing this very briefly, but this isn't an introductory webinar to the Environmental Voter Project, is a 4-step process. 1, we poll tens of thousands of people, isolate the ones who tell us that climate is their number 1 priority. And then we build what's called predictive models. What these are is we're able to assign scores to every single voter in a state, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their number 1 priority. And we do that not by talking to every single human being. Obviously, we can't do that, but by talking to tens of thousands of them, figuring out who cares deeply about climate and the environment, and then working with data scientists to find other people like them. And it's a long, iterative process where we optimize and fine-tune these models. But at the end of the day, we have a highly accurate list of individuals, not groups of people, but actual individuals who have a really high probability of listing climate as their number 1 priority. Then we look at those people's public voting histories And we just narrow down to the ones who we know don't vote that often. We don't need data scientists to help us with that. That's public record. All right, then we can move to number 2, mobilization. Now we've got this list of people who don't need their minds changed. They just need their behavior changed. And so we work with thousands of volunteers around the country to canvass and call and send postcards to these voters. We also, as a staff, will send digital ads and direct mail to them. And all of our messaging is just focused on one thing, and that is, how do we change the behavior of these non-voting environmentalists? 3, habit reinforcement. Even though we live behavioral science every day, you don't need to live it every day in order to understand a pretty easy concept. And that is, if you're trying to change someone's habits, you can't just talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. That is not how you change habits. No, you need to talk to people as often as possible. And so we work year-round, and that's not just a talking point. It is now April of 2023, and we have already been active in 102 different elections in 2023 alone. And that's not because every single one of these small local elections is supremely important for environmental policymaking. Obviously, they're not. Many of them are, but many of them aren't. But what every single one of them is important for is changing people's habits. When you are in the behavior change business, you need to view every election as a precious behavioral intervention opportunity. And so with the Environmental Voter Project, not only do we identify these non-voting environmentalists and then bring behavioral science-informed messaging to bear to get them to vote, but we work year-round in every election, big and small, to try to build up those good voting habits. And eventually that brings us to step 4, changing the electorate. Because at the end of the day, only by building these consistent super voters who care about climate can we change policymaking. Because if you're a politician, whether you're a city councilor or president of the United States, I guarantee you care a hell of a lot more about what voters think than what non-voters think. And so we are in the business not of getting non-voters to care more about climate change, but rather getting more voters who care about climate change and the environment. Ultimately, that's how we hold politicians' feet to the fire. All right, if you want more information about our work at the Environmental Voter Project, we are active in these 19 states that you see on this map. We just a few months ago expanded into Louisiana and Nebraska. We're working in these states every day in local, state, and federal elections. And if you want more information about our work, in the notes, you'll find a link to environmentalvoter.org/about. Very, very briefly, we've been getting some great results. Every single time we make an intervention in one of these elections, local, state, or federal, we set aside a control group of unlikely to vote environmentalists who we don't talk to. What that allows us to do after the election is actually isolate how much we at EVP were solely responsible for increasing turnout. And what we could see just in 2022, a high turnout midterm election year, is that we at EVP were solely responsible for increasing turnout of low propensity environmental voters by as much as 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries and as much as 1.8 percentage points in statewide general elections. These are big numbers in the politics business. Big numbers. We're enormously proud of that and enormously grateful to the many volunteers and donors who are here today joining us for helping us achieve these numbers. But even more importantly is that over time, even if we are not able to precisely measure our impact in a particular election, we're still creating more new voters. We just can't prove it. But every time we talk to one of these low propensity voters, we tag them in our voter file and we track them and we see what elections they vote in. And since we launched the Environmental Voter Project in just one state 7 years ago, we know that we have now communicated with over 9.5 million unique individual voters, all of whom, by definition, have a high likelihood of listing climate as their top priority, and were unlikely to vote. They were low propensity voters, or else we wouldn't have been talking to them. And as of 2 months ago, we could see in voter files that a stunning 1.48 million of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent local, state, and federal elections. They had become super voters. They had become such consistent voters that if you were running for dog catcher, you would look at the voter file and say, oh yeah, that person's definitely going to vote. Let's go and talk to them and figure out what issues they care about. And all of them have climate or other environmental issues as their top priority. That's how we change policymaking. And just for some context, these numbers are big. Let's just look at Arizona. These 110,000 super voters that we have helped create in Arizona since we, in 2019, expanded into Arizona. That's 10 times the margin of victory in the 2020 presidential election in Arizona. That's 6 times the margin of victory in the gubernatorial race just a few months ago in Arizona. These are big, big numbers. If you want to learn more about our results, we have tons of reports and other data on our website at environmentalvoter.org/results. Okay, let's dive in to the core of what we're discussing today. And, we are going to give you what we advertised, and that is a whole lot of data. So if you are ready to get nerdy, let's go. These green states that you see in the map, these 12 green states, these are the ones that we are covering. That being said, we are also active in those yellow states that you see. We are active in 19 states, but today we are going to focus on these 12 green ones because these all trend red. What I mean by that, because obviously some of these are very close sort of purple battleground states, is that all of these have a Republican partisan lean. Another way of putting that is whatever the national average is in a national election, like a midterm and a presidential, over the past 6 years, each of these 12 states have been at least 1 point more Republican than that average. And so in some states like Nevada, it is 1 point. In other states like Nebraska, it's 12 or 13 points. But all of these states trend red. Before we jump into the data, I also want to dive into just a little bit of definitions. When we say environmentalists, these are people we've identified and are now 2 months old predictive models as having a greater than 75% likelihood of not just caring about climate or clean air, clean water in the environment, but literally listing it as their #1 priority. They are also registered voters who did not vote in the 2020 presidential general election. Now, a small number of these people did not vote in 2020 because they were too young to, but the overwhelming majority of them were registered and were able to vote, yet they skipped it. And even for those who were too young, they still have not developed a robust voting record. And so we just need to assume that they are unlikely voters for the 2024 general election. And why are these key targets? Because these are the people who don't need their minds changed. These are the people who over the next 18 months need to be mobilized and turned into more consistent voters in order for the environmental movement to really flex our muscle over the next 18 months. Some more definitions. In the voter file, they do not track gender, they track sex. And so I just want to be very clear that when I use words like male or female or men or women, we are using that voter file terminology, even though sex and gender are not completely analogous. We just wanted to stay true to what was in the voter file. Similarly, for race, the voter file uses things like African American and Caucasian and these terms that we're not used to hearing and are largely antiquated. I will largely stick with those, but certainly in the presentation, you'll see those. Finally, I'll just say, for some demographic information, we have incomplete data. So some states don't ask you what your sex is when you register to vote, or some states ask you what your age is, but they don't make that publicly available. Oftentimes, data companies can fill in the gaps with consumer and other publicly available data, but sometimes we have high numbers of unknown when I start presenting demographic information. I just want to put that out there. All right, let's dive in to the data here. Are you ready? Okay. First, we're going to start about the 6 purple states that lean red: Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina. As you can see, we have identified huge numbers of non-voting environmentalists. Remember, what I mean by that is environment first registered voters who skipped the 2020 presidential election in these 6 crucially important states. So what do I mean by these numbers? First, partisan lean. Remember, what that means is this is how much they trend Republican in these states based off the national average. In a state like, say, Arizona, we identified almost 217,000 of these already registered voters who list climate and the environment as their top priority, who skipped the 2020 presidential. What does a number like 217,000 mean in Arizona? Well, the 2020 presidential election was only decided by 10,457 votes in Arizona. And so that is a big honking number. We also provided some more context here. Barely 3.4 million ballots were cast in that election in Arizona. And so 216,869 as a numerator over this number as a denominator. So how large is that population of latent environmental voters in comparison to all ballots that were cast last time there was a presidential election? Well, it would be so big, it would equal 6.3% of the entire electorate. That is a big deal. These non-voting environmentalists in places like Nevada, Arizona, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, to a lesser extent, Florida, are a huge, powerful, potential voting bloc. Potential. But I want to be clear. We know who these people are. Not to get creepy, but like we know them by name and street address. We can identify them. We have identified them. We have the tools to go and get them. There's a lot of latent political power there. All right, who are these folks? Well, let's start with Nevada. What you see here in these color-coded maps are the partisan leans that I told you about. So in Nevada, 103,000 of these non-voting environmentalists who are already registered to vote. As you can see, recent statewide elections in Nevada have been excruciatingly close. Whether you're a Democrat winning, like in last fall's US Senate race, by less than 8,000 votes, or a Republican winning in last fall's gubernatorial by a little bit more than 15,000 votes, or whether you're Biden winning by 33,000 in 2020, Nevada is now a really, really close state. In 2024, looking ahead, it's obviously going to be important for the presidential. There's going to be a very important US Senate race, and 3 out of those 4 House seats are currently rated by the Cook Political Report as being competitive. All right, who are these voters? If you look down here, I'm going to briefly explain what these charts mean because we're going to be presenting charts like this for all of the other 11 states. At the very bottom, you'll see registered voters. What this is an outline of all registered voters in the state of Nevada, broken down by demographic group. So what does that mean? It means that 10.4% of registered voters in Nevada are 18 to 24. Or 64.9% of registered voters in Nevada are white. All right. Above that row, you see NVEs. What that stands for is non-voting environmentalists. These are these already registered super environmentalists who skipped the last presidential election that we've been discussing. And you'll see, whoa, some big, big differences when compared to the overall electorate in Nevada. First off, what do we see? These folks are disproportionately young. That's probably not a big surprise to you. Yes, people who care deeply about climate and the environment yet aren't voting are disproportionately young. For sex, there's a lot of unknown data because Nevada is one of those states that doesn't make most of that data readily available. And you can see a lot of it is missing there. What else do we see? Disproportionately people of color. And you'll quickly see this is a trend in all of our states. Especially Black voters and AAPI, so Asian American and Pacific Islander voters, are overrepresented among these non-voting environmentalists. Hispanics, a little bit overrepresented, but not by much. And keep that in your head. Because if we were giving this presentation 2 or 4 years ago, every state would show that Hispanic voters are overrepresented. We no longer see that in every state. We see it in some states still, but not others. And Nevada is one of those states where it's kind of normalized. All right, next state, Arizona. Again, this has become a perpetual battleground. Look at how close all of these recent big elections have been in Arizona. Look at how close. And we've identified over 216,000 already registered super environmentalists who skipped the last presidential. Arizona is going to be big for president. It's going to be big for US Senate. There are currently 2 competitive US House seats, the 1st and the 6th. And again, remember, this color coding doesn't have to do with who the incumbents are. It has to do with a partisan lean. Now, in this instance, the 1st up here and the 6th down here do happen to be held by Republicans. So that's Schweikert up here and Siscomani down here. But remember, when you see these maps and all these slides, this is the partisan lean, not who controls the seats. All right, who are these non-voting environmentalists in Arizona? Again, disproportionately young. And again, disproportionately people of color. Now, Black voters are a very small percentage of the electorate in Arizona, yet we do see them disproportionately represented among our targets, these non-voting environmentalists. But what is driving the fact that people of color are such a big part of non-voting environmentalists in Arizona is less Black voters and more Hispanic voters and Native American voters. And so with Hispanic voters, remember what we saw in Nevada, there wasn't a big difference. But in Arizona, it's much, much bigger. And look at that number at the bottom there. 20% of the electorate in Nevada is Hispanic, 20.7 in Arizona, pretty much the same. But when you dial in on these non-voting environmentalists, there's a much, much bigger difference. They are much more heavily skewed to be Hispanic in Arizona than they are in Nevada. Similarly, Arizona, along with Alaska, which we'll discuss in a second, they're the 2 states among the 12 that we studied that have lots of Native American and indigenous voters. And in both of those states, we see a huge, huge overrepresentation among non-voting environmentalists. And we see that for 2 reasons. One, Native Americans are just much, much, much more likely to list climate and environmental issues as their top priority. Even if you throw vote propensity out the window, even if we didn't care about whether they're non-voting or voting, they're just more likely to care about these issues. But 2, then when you layer on vote propensity, it gets even higher. And as we'll discuss, a lot of that has to do with voter suppression. There's awful voter suppression against Native American communities, and we see that popping up in our data. All right, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, my original home state. I now live in Massachusetts, but where I grew up. This is also a perpetual swing state now, and you can just see how close these races are. It will once again be tight for president. It will once again be important for US Senate. It will once again be important for control of the House of Representatives. And when we look at who these non-voting environmentalists are in Pennsylvania, we again see this trend, disproportionately young, no surprise here. Look at what we see among 65 and older. You're going to start to see this in more and more of these states. It is no longer the case that you can just simply say, the older you get, the less likely you are to care about climate and the environment. No, that is absolutely not what we are seeing. If anything, what we are seeing is this dip among middle-aged people, especially people 50 to 64, kind of older Gen X. They are the ones who are least likely to care about climate and the environment. But then when you get to people 65 and older, it goes back up. Call this the grandmother effect because it tends to be more older women rather than older men, but it's both. They are actually the third most likely age group to care deeply about climate and the environment. Obviously not as high as young people, but much, much higher than middle-aged people. All right, we also start to see a little gender gap here in Pennsylvania. So normally on the overall electorate, there's only about a 4.5 point gender gap with women being more prevalent than men in the overall electorate in Pennsylvania. But that widens to a 12-point gap when we narrow in on non-voting environmentalists. Similar to what I was saying with Hispanic voters, we used to see this gender gap all the time, everywhere in all of our states. We don't see it as consistently now. We almost never see that men are more likely than women to care deeply about climate and the environment, but usually the gender gap is pretty small in most of the states now. But in some states, it's still pretty prevalent. And in Pennsylvania, that is certainly the case, although some of that has to do with that big unknown number that you see there. Also, look at this. Once again, people of color, much more likely to disproportionately represented among these non-voting environmentalists. A lot of that is driven by Black voters in Pennsylvania and AAPI voters. It is not driven at all by Hispanic voters. Look at that. And Hispanic voters are not a small population in Pennsylvania, especially up here around Allentown, Easton, sort of Steele area. There's in particular a strong Puerto Rican community in those areas in Lehigh County that 2-4 years ago was reliably much more progressive and reliably cared more about climate and environmental issues than we're seeing now. Is this a trend? I don't know. We need more data points to figure out if it's a trend, but it's certainly something that we're seeing. All right, Florida. Talk about a change in the Hispanic community. I am certainly not the first person that you have heard say that there is nothing monolithic about the Hispanic community, nor do I claim to have any special or expert insight into Hispanic voting patterns. I certainly don't. But what I can tell you is that the Environmental Voter Project 2-4 years ago saw that Hispanics were dramatically overrepresented among these environmentalists we had identified and among non-voting environmentalists. Now, it's pretty much even. It's pretty much even. Additionally, we have seen most of our targets move from South Florida up to the Jacksonville area or the I-4 corridor. Now, a lot of this is being driven by Cuban and Venezuelan Hispanics becoming more and more conservative, whereas a lot of the more Puerto Rican Hispanics are in the I-4 corridor, are remaining very concerned about climate and the environment. But there's a lot of stuff at play here. And again, I'm not going to pretend like I have the most nuanced expert understanding of this, but this is something that we're starting to see in the data. We also, again, see that 65 and older, yes, they're behind younger voters, but they're way ahead of middle-aged voters in caring deeply about climate and the environment. And Florida has seesawed back and forth. Obviously, 2022 was a year of landslides for Republicans in Florida, but 2016, 2018, 2020 were very close. I'm not going to pretend like I know what's going to happen in Florida, but I do know that it's a crucially important state for local, state, and federal climate policy. And it will be in play for president. It will be important for the US Senate, and it will be important for some House races in 2024. All right, Georgia. How about this? In 2024, you know what? There will not be a US Senate race in Georgia. How about that? Wow, it's been a long time since we could say that. No US Senate race in Georgia. But it will obviously remain crucially important, if not the single most important state for the presidential election. There will also likely be some other important statewide races like Public Service Commission, which has regulatory authority over utilities and clean energy, fossil fuels, things like that. You don't need me to tell you how razor thin the margins have gotten in Georgia. And look at that number. We have identified over 470,000 already registered super environmentalists who skipped the 2020 presidential election. They're overwhelmingly young. They are extraordinarily disproportionately Black. So if you look at registered voters in Georgia, there are twice as many white voters as Black voters. If you look at non-voting environmentalists in Georgia, it flips, and there are twice as many Black non-voting environmentalists as white non-voting environmentalists. This is the face of the modern environmental movement. If you have in your head that environmentalists are like white suburban yuppies, like forget about it. They're disproportionately people of color, disproportionately young, and although it's a little bit harder to trace, disproportionately lower income. We also see Hispanic voters are disproportionately represented, and to a lesser extent, AAPI voters. Native American voters probably disproportionately represented as well, although those numbers are so small that we have a little bit less certainty about comparing those numbers. All right, the last of our purple states, and then we'll get into the dark red ones. North Carolina. Do not sleep on North Carolina. I'll say it again. Do not sleep on North Carolina. One of my favorite talking points to trot out there is asking people, hey, guess which had a closer margin in the 2020 presidential election, Pennsylvania and North Carolina? Most people say Pennsylvania. It was North Carolina. Pennsylvania was decided by about 80,000 votes. North Carolina, 74,000 votes. Now, obviously, the denominator is bigger in Pennsylvania, but North Carolina has just as many electoral votes as Georgia. It's a big state and was decided by 74,000 votes in 2020. So this is going to continue to be relevant for the presidential. There is an open gubernatorial election in 2024 in North Carolina. There are currently 4 congressional seats that are rated as competitive by Cook Political Report. Now, you'll see I put that asterisk there. Due to changes in the state Supreme Court in North Carolina, not to mention a new veto-proof majority for Republicans in the state, in both houses of the state legislature, as well as some federal Supreme Court cases, it's possible, if not likely, that these congressional maps will be redrawn at some point over the next year, but there will still be congressional seats in play in North Carolina. All right. Whoa, disproportionately young. Over 90% of the non-voting environmentalists in North Carolina are under the age of 35. You'll see almost nobody in that 50 to 64 range is a non-voting environmentalist. North Carolina is one of those states where we see a pretty significant gender gap. It is also similar to Georgia, a state where if you look at registered voters, white voters are there are almost twice as many white voters as Black voters. But if you look at non-voting environmentalists, it flips. There are twice as many Black non-voting environmentalists as white non-voting environmentalists. North Carolina is also one of those states, similar to Arizona and similar to Georgia and similar to what you will soon see in Texas, I believe, where Hispanics are dramatically overrepresented in this population of non-voting environmentalists, similar with AAPI voters. All right. Did I tell you that this was going to be nerdy and there was going to be a lot of data? You are not here under false pretenses, folks. So if you're ready for 6 more states, let's dive into these super red states. All right. Certainly in most of these states, we can't claim that the population of non-voting environmentalists is larger than the margin in the last presidential election. It's not, although it is in Texas and close in Alaska. But still, in many of these states, there is this huge amount of latent political power out there in the climate and environmental movements. And that's so important when so much environmental and climate policy is being made at the local and state level. And it's even important on the federal level. We need to continuously ratchet up the pressure on policymakers by getting more and more climate voters and not climate non-voters. Politicians don't care about non-voters' priorities. All right, let's start with Texas. 721,000 non-voting environmentalists. That's bigger than the margin in 2020. That is 3 times the margin in the 2018 US Senate. Now, obviously, not as much as we see in Florida, but Texas is one of these states that's been going back and forth between not very close races and somewhat close races. But I think it's pretty safe to say that in 2024, Texas will be in the conversation for the presidency. It will be in the conversation for control of the US Senate. And currently there are 3 competitive House seats there. Again, this target population is disproportionately young. What's that? 91.5% of non-voting environmentalists are under the age of 35. We see a huge gender gap in Texas. A huge gender gap. Among registered voters, there are 5 percentage points more women than men. Among non-voting environmentalists, it's 21.5 percentage points. It's a huge, huge gender gap in Texas. And again, we see that this population is disproportionately Black. As I mentioned before, Texas is one of the states where it's still disproportionately Hispanic. And we also see that it is disproportionately AAPI. Iowa. Iowa is not a particularly close state, usually for statewide elections, but 2 out of their 4 congressional seats are going to be very, very close. You can see in the demographic breakdown of Iowa, it is, again, disproportionately people of color, in particular, Black and AAPI. And we are still seeing that kind of like reverse Nike swoosh here, where the 65 and older are really popping, not as much as young people, but they're popping. All right, Alaska. We don't have a color-coded map of Alaska because there's only 1 congressional seat. It's currently held by Mary Peltola, who you see won by a 5,200 vote margin last year. Alaska is becoming a closer state. I don't think it's at the point where it's a consistent battleground or even an inconsistent battleground, but it might be getting there. It might be getting there. I'm not a prognosticator. I'm not a pundit, but like keep an eye on Alaska. Keep an eye on Alaska. This is one of those states where, because there is such inconsistent data about voters' ages, we didn't even bother putting it in there. It just would have been misleading. But what we can see is a gender gap. Alaska is one of the very few states, maybe the only state, where there are more men than women, and that shows up among registered voters. But it goes back to being disproportionately female when we look at non-voting environmentalists. And again, I say the word female because we're looking at voter file sex data rather than gender data, which isn't available. Racial breakdown, again, disproportionately people of color. That is not being driven by Black voters in Alaska. There are very few Black voters in Alaska, nor is it being driven by Hispanic voters. Look at that. Hispanics are actually underrepresented among non-voting environmentalists in Alaska. Instead, it's being driven by a huge population of Asian American and Pacific Islander voters who care deeply about climate and the environment, and Native American voters. Look at that. Look at those numbers. Huge, huge jumps. Huge, huge jumps. All right, Kansas. Although Kansas does have a Democratic governor who won by a very tight margin in 2022, I don't think it's safe to say that this is going to be a state that is sexy in 2024, except for that one House seat that Sharice Davids represents, the 3rd congressional district. Once again, we see a pretty consistent story here. Non-voting environmentalists, overwhelmingly young. We do see a pretty significant gender gap, and they are disproportionately people of color, in this instance being driven by Black voters and to a lesser extent AAPI and Hispanic voters. Louisiana. Louisiana is even more grossly gerrymandered than some of the other states I've mentioned as being grossly gerrymandered, like Florida, and I don't know if I said it for Texas, but Texas. So there probably won't be House districts in play, although it's possible from lawsuits that it might change. That being said, this year in 2023, there's an open gubernatorial, may be competitive, may not be competitive. Next year, there will be statewide public service commission races. But even at the local and state level, it is so important that we in the climate movement pay attention to states like Louisiana. Local and state policymakers have an enormous amount of authority over the siting of fossil fuel infrastructure. And if there is any state where the fossil fuel industry is killing people more than anywhere else, it's Louisiana, with toxic air and poison water and supercharged extreme weather. This is ground zero for all of our great climate and environmental crises. And whether you live in Louisiana or one of the other 49 states, we, not just for strategic reasons, but for moral reasons, need to do everything we can to help Louisianans. This is the front line. This is the front line. Once again, we see it's not just young people, but 65 and up that are popping. We also see that flip among white and Black voters. There are twice as many white voters as Black voters when you look at the entire electorate, but when you look at non-voting environmentalists, it's twice as many Black voters as white voters. We don't see that Hispanics are overrepresented in Louisiana, but we do see a bump among AAPI voters. All right, last state, Nebraska. Don't sleep on Nebraska. That second congressional district, not only does it have no partisan lean, currently represented by Don Bacon, a Republican, but remember, Nebraska, like Maine, awards single electoral college votes by congressional district. That second electoral college vote, not to supercharge your anxiety here, but there is not a small chance, let's put it that way, that one electoral college vote could decide everything in 2024. This is important. Similar to what we saw in Louisiana, wow, 65 and up is really really popping there. Black voters, AAPI voters, Native American voters are the ones there who are disproportionately represented among these non-voting environmentalists. All right, as I said, we did not sell you a false bill of goods here. We told you this would be nerdapalooza. This would be more data than you could possibly imagine. Hopefully, this is what you expected. Most of our webinars do a little bit more on experimental stuff or telling you about our voter turnout results, but we told you this would be voter file data, and boy, did you get it. So if we could distill this down into 4 major takeaways, first is, in these really tight purple, red-leaning states, Arizona, Georgia, and Nevada, there are so many of these non-voting environmentalists that they would equal 14 times Biden's combined margin of victory in 2020. 14 times. This is the opportunity that we have in the environmental movement, particularly those organizations that are focused on voter turnout. Second big takeaway, in states like Alaska, Louisiana, and Texas, even small increases in environmental voter turnout could really impact local and statewide policymaking. And that's so important when things like fossil fuel infrastructure siting and zoning and things like that can often decide whether a new oil field or petrochemical plant comes online. What we've also seen is that these environment-first non-voters are pretty consistently disproportionately Black and AAPI And then certainly in the states where the numbers are large enough that we can reliably measure Native American and Indigenous voters, we also see that. This is what the modern environmental movement looks like. And if I could add one more takeaway, it would be to think about what the ramifications of this are. If, I feel comfortable saying it is true, the modern environmental movement is disproportionately people of color and young people. Well, what that also means is that we in the climate and environmental movement need to pay extra special attention, not just to environmental and climate matters, but to voting rights and ballot access and civil rights matters. Because any government entity, local, state, or federal, that is trying to make it harder for someone to vote is always focused on young people, Black people, Native Americans, or other people of color. And so those government officials or those legislators who are crafting bills probably aren't sitting there, twirling their mustache saying, oh, let's get those environmentalists. They might not even know that it's having a disproportionately bad impact on the environmental movement, but it is. Any time that anybody anywhere is making it harder for young people or people of color to vote, they are draining power from the environmental movement. And so it's incumbent upon us to take on those fights as well, not just because we want to be good allies and good citizens, but because it goes to the core of the environmental movement's power. All right, let's finish up. If you would like to get involved with our work, please take a moment to volunteer. These links will be in the notes to this video, environmentalvoter.org/get-involved to volunteer. You can sign up to Phone Bank, to Canvas, to write postcards. We would also love to have your financial support. You can donate any amount. You can donate millions of dollars. We will take it. You can donate $5. We will take it. We had almost 9,000 individual donors last year in 2022. We are a grassroots funded organization and we need your help. We have found these non-voters. We know what messages work to turn them into consistent voters. We just need the money and the volunteers to make it happen. And then finally, if you would like to host your own Zoom event, I'd be happy to come. I won't present all of this data to your friends. Instead, I'll present a much shorter, perhaps more interesting overview of what the Environmental Voter Project does, why, and what our results are. But I'd love to hear from you, so please email me and we can set that up. Finally, I just want to say two more things. We are now 3 days away from the end of a big monthly donor campaign. A very generous donor has agreed to provide a $50,000 gift to us if we get 100 new monthly donors in this month of April. We've gotten 83 new monthly donors. We need 17 more over the next 3 days. And here's the deal. A monthly donation of any amount qualifies. Obviously, you can give us $100 a month or $1,000 a month, but you could give us $5 a month and help us unlock this $50,000 gift. Boy, could we use that. And then finally, I'll just say just a few days ago, we announced the creation of a new free monthly newsletter. You can subscribe. This link will also be in the notes. And what you will get is our new Overlooked in Climate Politics newsletter. It is always short and to the point. We will very briefly just go through 3 important but underreported stories on climate politics, and we will finish with one easy way for you to take action. Even if you're already subscribed to our emails, please feel free to forward this to your friends. It is free. And because we have to research when all of these teeny little elections are going on in places, we know about these really cool opportunities and we want to get the word out there. All right. Thank you. Normally, we would follow this with a Q&A session. As some of you know, when we tried to do this as a live webinar, Zoom was having some crashing issues for many of our attendees, not to mention for some of the presenters. So we won't follow with a Q&A, but we always welcome your questions. Please go to our website. We'd love to hear from you. And boy, would we love to see you at one of our volunteer events. And don't forget to become a monthly donor. Thank you all so, so much. We really appreciate your involvement in our work, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.